All right, that's how we get to start it. So we are on part 2 of episode 101 with Marcus Singletary, who also runs a company called Cloaked Entry Co. Would you explain for those who are only somehow catching in on part 2 what it is you do as a for your through your company?
All right. So for Cloaked Entry Co, we do is we provide training for covert and non-destructive entry. So the covert part that could be just for our military personnel. That could be for, quite frankly, we teach everybody. So we don't do closed enrollment courses. We do privates, but we don't do closed enrollment. So um, covert and non-destructive entry. The non-destructive side is more so for your first responders, guys that would like to save their department money by not destroying things to get into places. So we teach lockpicking, bypassing, electronic bypass, key cloning, key generation, all that stuff. So if you guys ever have questions, feel free to hit me up on Instagram or on the website.
Good to hear. So we started on a conversation and we've been building into one for a while now. And I think it's time that we bring it to the forefront, and that is the difference between risk and reward, or risk versus reward, excellence versus safety, and power and anonymity. Now, I think you brought this up when you were talking a little bit on the difference between the actions of an organization like the FBI and the willingness of the individual of what we call gun culture or the community to even participate in certain activities. Are you able? Can you poise the question so that we engage with it?
So the way I brought it up prior to was essentially there is, I guess I could say, a lack of vision towards the why we're doing the action. Whereas the whatever agency you're dealing with, right? It's their bread and butter. They get paid for it. There's anonymity with the job, and there's also protections that kind of come with that job. So the risk is inherently lower than the opposite of that spectrum, which would be like your average your civilians or your citizens doing it, um, where it's not only just frowned upon in some instances, or it might be completely illegal. But when it comes to the risk versus reward question for me is, as long as I understand the risk and the risk is inherently lower than the reward that I would get out of that, I'm okay with taking that risk. Which, if you're good, you I won't say you won't get caught, but the chances of you, or the probability of you getting caught doing whatever action that is significantly lower. So that pushes the excellence portion that we are going to go into after that.
All right. So, what's the biggest difference, or what is one of the things that makes the Navy SEAL the most dangerous, or so dangerous?
Training, and the fact that he has a lot of people behind him that also have the experience to back that training.
That makes sense. And I'm picking a Navy SEAL as a generic, well recognizable special operations dude who's been well trained.
Yep.
I think the answer is sanction. Is that when he goes out and he does a night raid, he doesn't come home to a prison cell and a giant fee, right? There are all these things that give him skill sets and abilities, the training, the money, the financing, the support network, the infrastructure, and at the end of the day, one of those things too is that when he comes home, he's not a villain, he's a hero.
So I'm gonna fight. I'm not gonna say I'm gonna fight you on this, but I'm gonna give you another perspective on that as well. So then, what would be the difference between the Navy SEALs and those highly trained? Um, I'll essentially say these SF cartel units, right? The Los Zetas, who are all like former, SF guys from Mexico or some shit like that, because they're still very much villains, and they also have that skill set, but they lack sanctions, right? They're still very much villains. They're going to be looked at as villains. Maybe not by the populace. That might be a little bit different. But in all essence, they are actually villains.
Okay. It's not in what do you mean? Well, I guess essence is a loaded term when you're talking about philosophy. Is that if we were to say in essence, there's nothing that that person could have been other than a villain, and I think we come to the conclusion that they're villains by their moral choices,
Yes.
which exist within an ethical framework, and they may see themselves as the heroes, but I will argue that they're wrong. You know,
I think they see themselves as heroes.
you don't.
I don't think they think there's zero. I think they know they're the bad guys and they're okay with it. And I think that comes down to,
Ah.
and that's what we're talking about here right now, right? Where it's like, all right, cool. I know that I could definitely be branded a criminal. I can definitely be thrown in jail, but I see the reward being vastly higher than the risk that I am taking. Or I'm completely okay with acknowledging the fact that the risk is just as high as the reward, and I'm gonna fucking do it anyway. I think those people are extremely fucking dangerous because they know they're the bad guys. They don't give a fuck that they're the bad guys. They're under no delusion that they're good guys.
This is why in contemporary culture we have this sort of obsession and fear of the psychopath. Is that they have no emotional like. Well, the strange thing that maybe an ethical question worth asking is: can a psychopath understand moral codes? Can a sociopath understand moral codes? Because we assume that, well, in some cases, we take one as a person who has no empathy and remorse for other people, but that doesn't mean that he's incapable of understanding moral codes.
Right.
And the same thing goes for the sociopath, is that he may have no concern for social impact of his actions, but that doesn't mean he's not capable of understanding um a ingrained moral code.
Hmm. Um, I think it's something that can be acknowledged, but not necessarily acted upon or followed. So I think they can understand the concept of a moral code, but does that mean there's something that they'll act on and actually live by? I don't think that's the case. I think you can understand something without accepting it.
So is a sociopath because he discards it, or is it, or because he doesn't have the ability? Because we're talking about essence versus choice. Because, for example, can a psychopath not act on his psychopathy?
Probably not.
Oh,
I don't know.
I
I'm not.
would. I think this is where we might disagree. Is that I think a person can be a psychopath.
Uh,
They don't have they do not have they do not have like the cognition or the ability to comprehend certain things, but they can still choose not to do evil things.
hmm. I don't know enough about psychopaths, at least as far as like cognitively, to understand if it's more of it's just impulse all the
Sure.
versus there is some level of impulse control and they just choose when to act on the impulse
Hmm.
because then at that point it kind of is a choice because if they can forego it in while facing those impulses, then they probably can also make the choice of not doing it at all.
Hmm. Because I think you could argue, and this is where some psychologist or psychotherapist or whatever is just going to be like, ah, children don't know what they're talking about, because all of them have an Austrian accent, even though that was a terrible Austrian accent.
That was definitely
Um,
right.
so we'll move on. Um, but the point that I'm saying here is we oftentimes identify people by their actions.
Hmm.
We identify the potential the potential presence of sociopathy or psychopathy in a person by their actions, but that's not the same thing as them having. It's not the same thing as them being immoral or acting immorally. Like or we may identify something through someone's actions, but that does not. What's the word that I'm trying to say? Categorize? No. That doesn't define. No. There's a word I'm looking for and it's evading me and it bothers me. But it happens pretty regularly, so I just have to put up with it.
Yeah.
The presence of a person's actions might help us identify the presence of psychopathy. So without the actions, but that can a person be psychopathic? Perhaps. They just are they're still able to make decisions otherwise. And if psychopathy is purely just impulse control, that there's nothing else to you, and this would be an essence argument, that the essence of a psychopath is somebody who is purely impulse, then we're dealing with a different cup of tea. It's just back to the definitions. So So when we have this example of people willing to do what we consider evil, and the difference between c- people in, let's just use an organization like a law enforcement organization, or even like a secret police, right? So if we're going to create a fictional secret police, they're motivated to do it because they have pay, and their inhibitions are restricted because they have anonymity. You see how we're building this?
Mhm.
And I'm trying to, and I'm thinking about it in different ways. Is those are different examples, other than do they believe what they're doing is right?
Mm. Well, if
Because how
they
would
have,
you apply it to the civilian? The civilian has no anonymity because we don't have privacy anymore. Privacy is more property without privacy is pointless.
right.
But they don't have anonymity in a surveillance state, and they're not getting paid to do something. Why
Hmm.
would, right? So the let's just call them situational context does not is not conducive to whatever this activity is. And I'm using, we don't have an example of the case because we're not really building one, but they believe it's moral and there's an imperative to do it.
Right.
That's very different than a person who is unconcerned about the moral imperatives involved, but has a financial, it's not motivation, yeah, maybe a financial motivation, and no, or reduced inhibition because of something like anonymity.
Right. Um, Once again, I think that's all going to come down to vision, man. Um, we constantly see people. How often do we go online and we see people talking about being a pedo hunter, or I don't know if that's going to get blanked out later, but being a pedo hunter, or throw them in a wood chipper, or hang the tyrants, or all these grandiose fucking sayings, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they're not willing to actually push anything towards that vision. So it's you you. I guess that means there's a disconnect between the actual vision versus what they're willing to give up for that vision, right? And that's a really hard one. That's actually a really hard one to argue. I thought about it quite a bit, because it's like, all right, well, what's to stop me from just being a martyr, or making shit worse by doing something, um, like going after a governor or some shit like that, right? Like we saw in fucking Michigan, like, because that could have a damning effect on the rest of the two-way culture as a result of that one move. Um,
Yeah,
because at the end of the day, you're not going to be the one that gets to tell the story. That story can get told by pretty much legacy media. That's what's going to happen.
sure. Yeah. No, I get the point. It's a good
So
argument.
that's why I say, like, gathering information or pushing something in a non-violent fashion seems like the better alternative towards the vision, right? Even if it's on a lower scale, if that's maybe handicapping some bad actors at the low level, because now there's an actual repercussion to those actions, right? Because when I work a job, I know there's repercussions coming from one end and one end only, and that's going to be from people above me. But if it's coming from other people outside of that, I have some other considerations to push into my decision making.
By handicapping, we're talking about reducing the anonymity that an individual might have, reducing the protections that are, or identifying that they're not present. That's kind of what I would think of is.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I've been pushing, as far as, like, just as a thought experiment of, let's just say back in the revolution, right? Those people they were regular people that still had to work jobs, even though they were essentially fighting a war at the same time. So it's no different than what we're actually, if they were to do the same thing right now, except they're not really fighting a war. So is there an excuse to be like, well, I'm just not gonna, I have a job, and I'm like, okay, so did they, motherfucker, and they were actively having to peel caps back after they got done doing their job, and they had to do it under the guise of hopefully not getting their house burned down for being a conspirator or whatever else. So I'm like, so what's really the disconnect? I think it's more so just the comfort of society has done far more damage to the lethality of Americans than anything else has.
Yeah, we don't know what we believe in. We don't care anymore.
No, I think you'll only go as far as your comfort will let you.
No, your comfort will, if you your comfort will rule you where your conviction is lacking.
Ooh, okay, that's a good way to say that.
Yeah. I mean, it's comfort is a thing. It's not something to be discredited. It's not something to be thrown out. It's not something to be just completely disregarded as something useless. Complacency is maybe more of a moral argument, but comfort is something different. Now, being willing to push through discomforting, or this chair is too squeaky, moving. Being able to push through discomforting scenarios is a sign of conviction. It is something valuable. But it's like, it's interesting in that sense. I almost would say the argument that we see going on in our culture so much more difficultly is we're being, I wouldn't say prevented from, that's not the right answer. But we're looking for an incentive motive for something that is much deeper than an incentive motive, and that is, what do you live for?
Mm,
Right? Okay, dude, let's just do some thought experiments. If tomorrow all the social media censorship just evaporated, right? It was gone. And I'm talking about not like universal perfect free speech or whatever you want to call it, where like even, the bad stuff was available. And we're talking about just clearly immoral activities, but like just in the cleanest of sense. If tomorrow Instagram came out and said, "Hey, we're sorry for infringing on your First and Second Amendment rights in regards to firearms content and individual liberty and sovereignty, we're gonna, no, we're gonna take the shadow banning sanctions off or the shadow banning off your pages and stuff." Would that change anything for people? No, not at all. It would be less difficult in certain areas, but that wouldn't give you motivation to build a company or run a program or make an argument or build a society or nothing, whatever. I think the biggest thing that we're facing, as far not the biggest thing, one of the gosh, if I could go down to the core of it, the challenge that we are facing is that we either are too lazy to believe in anything, or we don't know what we believe in and we don't care about it enough.
I think part of that is because we've always been fed who we are because we've had a richer history than most, right? As far as our beginnings, our secession from the crown. Um, so that's essentially that nationalism. That's always been who we are, and it's been pumped down our throats. And I think that dilutes over time.
Sure. Well, if you read the Gawain poet, and when we're talking about British history, English history, there's a section where they drew their history from the fall of Troy. Everyone has an origin story.
Yeah, but I would say in our nationalism, we are like the star spangled children of the world, right? The world police, we are the definition of freedom, right? That's at least that's how it's pushed. So, but like anything else, just like 9/11, right? Everything over time dilutes. People start to forget, or it just means less, or you don't find it as compelling as before. If you talk maybe even 50 years after the revolution, those people were probably still had teeth and they were ready to. They probably would buck at the first sign of infringement or some shit because it's still fresh. But now we're moving. Let's move 100, 200, 300 years up the line. At this point, it's just a fucking fable. It doesn't mean as much because time has disconnected you from that so much. So you really have to kind of find your own reasoning, I suppose, your own why. Um, I would say that's kind of what we're going through right now.
I think we're starting to hone in on what we're talking about too. I agree with that, in the sense of we have all of the issues. We have all the materials at our disposal to some extent. if you're to take the United States right now and you're to look at people within the United States, the amount of resources that we have access to, the materials, the just even the individual in the United States, the firearms, the stuff, the gear, the night vision, the whatever. We have all these toys, we have all these tools, we have all this equipment, we have all this stuff that we've dedicated our lives and time to train for. It's the intellectual equipment that's missing,
Yeah,
or the gap there is more glaring, and I think that that is being solved. I am not the only person who sees this, so I think that gap is being addressed, maybe, and
yeah,
some will make it out and some won't.
yeah. And that's going to be the case for everything, right? There's just going to be you're going to have stragglers that just aren't going to make it. I agree because if you look, I would say looking back, even 10 years ago to right 10 years ago to right now, it's such a vastly different picture of firearms ownership, the Second Amendment crowd in general, um, where all you had was the NRA a few years, 10 years ago, or even, probably more than that. But you had the NRA as the parent organization for everything gun rights, even though they
The
no,
poster child.
yeah. So they were the poster child for Second Amendment and gun ownership 10 plus years ago. But now you have a bunch of other organizations that are doing the exact same thing. Proliferation of certain things that would have never been imagined 10 years ago, right? Night vision is pretty much it's it's a fairly common thing now, right? You're not talking like night vision handhelds and shit. You're talking like dual tubes, quads. Like you would have never guessed that the proliferation of certain pieces of gear that was only known really to the military would be such a normal household thing these days. So it is definitely being addressed. It's happening at actually a pretty breakneck pace to really think about like how fast all that happened. And now the people are just as well, are actually probably better well armed than most government agencies as far as certain things go. So it's definitely interesting to see the massive like crunching of the timeline and watching everything speed up so fast.
Yeah, because we talk about it in equipment. Yeah, no, I see it. I'm going back to this difference between excellence and safety, and then I'm pulling it out of how we think about um, the why behind what we're doing, and I that's been a strong, that has become the single most important question of not just why do we do what we do, as if you're trying to create a post hoc justification, but it's there's something deeper here going on that we're leaving on that stone very unturned, and I think that's where we're having a crisis at. Once again, I'll bring it up again. The leading cause of death amongst isn't one of the leading causes of not death, but like one of the, so we'll just go straight into it. Suicide. Like suicide is a bourgeoisie problem.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe bourgeoisie isn't the right term, but it is not a problem of certain issues. And so, you know, I don't see people lacking. I mean, yes, we'll make jokes about people not having Gucci gear or whatever, or having Gucci gear or whatever, but people don't argue over that kind of stuff. They argue, oh, your barrel is too short for the pending apocalypse or whatever your goal is. It's like, okay, no, you're not. They're not arguing that the essence of your barrel being too short is an immorality. They're saying it's insufficient for the thing that you're claiming to pursue.
Yes. Yeah. So,
So,
um, yeah. Uh,
what do you believe? You will find out what you believe when it starts to cost you something.
yes, I know I've said that before, and we had a nice long conversation with Vlad after that.
Oh yes, oh yes.
I think we had
Good
like a
old Vlad.
hour conversation after that.
Hmm. And in some ways, you can find out what that is by making it cost you something now.
I think it's hard to replicate loss.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Risk.
Really
Risk.
hard to do that.
Hmm.
So when we talk about, you're like, oh, well, you have to know what you're willing to lose, right? So there's no way to kind of steadily put that pressure on to understand more finely where that line is, because you can go way too far in one direction and you can't go far enough in another direction. Right. So I think we kind of had the litmus test that happened to us pretty recently, right? With the whole COVID thing, with the BLM riots and stuff like that. You kind of figure out, even if it's not directly tied to like who you are, if what you care about and what you don't fucking care about. So
Yeah, in the beginning of 2020, when we started seeing the whole COVID thing kick off,
yep,
people started paying attention to who their friends were,
yep,
and they start because a friends was somebody else willing to maybe break curfew to go visit.
yeah,
And then once we got into June, after Minneapolis decided to turn itself into a tiki torch,
yep,
well, actually, no, that's gonna allow people to make excuses. When um, the people who claimed oppression decided that the expression of their disappointment was to burn down buildings, and they wonder why there's now new parts of town that are destitute. Sorry, dude, you did this to yourself.
mm,
Um, not sorry. I mean, it's a Midwestern thing to use sorry as a word like But moving on, and now you have, and so when when that period started taking on, and when that event started happening, people started paying attention to who their enemies were, who
yep,
were their liabilities, who were the people who might sell them out,
yep,
or and so that was an interesting time. And then we went back to, and then we went back to what? Well, you're not going to live in a permanent state of crisis. I'll tell you that much.
yep. I think that was so. Even then, man, I was sitting back watching the riots on Instagram and fucking Snapchat and all that crazy shit. Even on the news, man, I was like, man, this is super interesting to watch. You know how people,
Uh,
the human condition as of right now, and then the COVID thing, man. I'm gonna send you a link to my buddy Dan. He did a recent interview on Black Rifle Coffee podcast or whatever, um, and pretty much told the entire story of what we were dealing with the whole COVID thing on the inside of the military during that time, all the illegal shit that was going on. And it looked a lot like the anthrax shit when it first kicked off, and most people don't even realize that that was a thing too. But um, yeah, watching some people being vehemently against it for whatever their reasons were, and there were a lot of different reasons out there. And then watching them kind of betray themselves, like you saw men change. Like there were people that had a visible, like, and you can tell that they sacrificed part of who they were for fear of losing a job or for just being uncomfortable or having any of that shit. And you saw these people; they were like shells of human beings, man. It was rough. It was rough watching dudes see them hate themselves after doing something they know they did not want to do, but out of fear doing it anyway.
mm,
Um, so that was interesting to watch. Um, and I got a guy after deployment. He came from third bat, and same thing. He's like, man, I want to do a long walk eventually. I was like, all right, cool, man. I was like, hey, but he's like, I don't want the shot. I was like, hey, brother. I was like, if you're going anywhere in SOCOM or USASOC, you're getting that fucking shot. You're not going anywhere. Like I can tell you that right fucking now. SOC can kind of retain the ability to do that all on their own, especially if you're in a student status. There's nothing you can do about it. You don't get shot, bye. See ya. Smell your fucking 3 years later whenever you want to fucking try and come back. But that was the mandate. And like if you're in a student status, you have zero power in student status. So I was like, hey man. So I started having the actual conversation with him. Like, hey man, what's your price? And that was one of my biggest phrases during that time was, what's your fucking price, man? I was like, is being an operator mean more to you than what the shot can potentially do to you, or is it the other way around? I'm like, if you want to actually continue on with your career, don't feel bad about it either. I was like, eat that fucking consequence with a smile on your fucking face and go do what you want to fucking do. Just as long as you understand the possible consequences behind it and you're okay with the consequence, eat that consequence and keep fucking moving, dude. Like, do it unapologetically though. Like, don't be feeling bad for yourself and fucking, oh, dude, like, nah, dude, quash that shit. You knew what it was. Like, I think that's like the essence of being a fucking direct human being, a person that is like living with that purpose. It's like you understood your purpose. This was an obstacle to your purpose. Don't feel bad about fucking going through that obstacle and having to do what you got to do. It is what it is. Like the consequences are all yours though. So that's another thing. Like the consequences are yours and no one else's. So if this shot turns around and kills you, that's okay. Like that's what you wanted though. If it doesn't and you go and you achieve your fucking dreams, great. That's good.
So
But
it's an interesting way of saying it. If you know, if that's the consequence, you know, you did doing what you wanted to do. You're like, well, I mean, I guess kind of. There is compulsion to it. There seems to be a difference here between what you're making an argument for is there's a difference between the circumstances and the morality of the circumstances.
yes.
So, for example, compulsion. We have a certain distaste for compulsion where I'm compelling you to do certain things. And sometimes that can come in the form of I'm compelling my friend to live a better life and he doesn't like it, so he leaves it or runs away, something like that. I mean, there's situations like that, but then there's also something a little bit different of like coercion. So
Yes.
I know that I'm being coerced and I'm able to and function in it, or I know I'm being coerced and it's owning me, and that's an ugly position. I think the Old Testament oftentimes talks about debt in this way of you do not want to acquire debt because it is a way that somebody that can coerce you, which you will grow resentful for.
Hmm.
And this is a argument not to do something because of something that it does to you. Whereas he can so this kid can say that he's being coerced and that's wrong, but that doesn't mean that he is absolved from making the decision. He has
Right.
to choose.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. That's
Yeah.
very much it. Like and granted, I go back now and I'm like, maybe I was a little bit too harsh on people because I don't have to live their choices. They do. Um,
Sure, fair enough.
and I was very harsh on those people, man. Like unapologetically, because I was like, dude, you let these motherfuckers ruin your fucking life over some shit that you could have definitely like. If you just learned a little bit more about the process. Like I went through that entire ordeal and I never got the shot. And I'm sitting in Soccer right fucking now,
Mhm.
instructor position. I'm like, because it all went away. I was like, so there was a way to fight it without having to say yes or no to the fucking to the question. Is that you just didn't care enough to learn about the process in order to kind of play the system a little bit to buy yourself
Mhm.
some time.
How bureaucratic.
Super bureaucratic, dude. I was lucky, man. Once again, I had a guy that was literally fighting, that was suing the fucking the Secretary of Defense of the Army, or the Secretary of Defense, over the mandate. And so he was handing me every shred of legal advice he could hand me
Mhm.
through that process. And in turn, I was giving that process to my fucking guys. And I was like, hey man, here's how you fucking fight this. This is how you're gonna do this. And some people were just like, you know what? Nah, it's all good. This is what I want to do. I'm gonna go ahead and get the shot. And I was like, yeah, I can respect the fuck out of that.
Yeah. Well, we had the vaccine issue was an easy asymmetry in culture, and I think that's what bothered people. And
Mm,
then we're still talking about the vaccine 3 years later, which is like I'm not saying it's cringy. It still is relevant, and maybe we're asking questions like, what are some other asymmetries that we can observe?
mm.
But the easy asymmetry of the vaccine thing was if you got it and you were happy, no one gave you an if you were got it and you were confident, there was nothing against it. And if you didn't get it
Yep.
and you were confident, you were in trouble. And if you were concerned about it, you were in trouble. And so, I think that the word cult gets thrown around a lot, and as a theologian, it has a specific meaning. But I think the issue is easy is the asymmetry, and then when issues happens out of it, the people who are overly the top and I mean, there were a lot of other issues. Some of them being things like coercion, and some of them being things like mandates, and some of them being things like um, liabilities and no redress of grievances. You know, these are some major issues. But once again, we're going to end up in a conversation that the issue is the asymmetry. It
Yep.
wasn't the presence of, and any sort of argument to the otherwise is dishonest, whether you're a doctor or not. The argument is the asymmetry is that you have provided an environment where people are considered less than human because they don't take your financially beneficial choice that's protected by the government,
Yeah.
and then and yet they don't hold any grievance against you for being confident in your decision. It's it's garbage.
Yeah.
But there's another asymmetry that we see in our culture and our environment is that um some people are willing to act on their convictions, and some people are willing to act and some people are not, and that you were describing that through the power of anonymity.
Yes. So the whole anonymity thing. Once again, the framing that I kind of placed it in was just bad actors in general, right? So typically speaking, they are people that have some sort of political power, um, whether that be through law enforcement or through or power of policy. I'll say because policy can go anywhere. That can be policy of a private organization. That could be municipality. It could be any of those things. But power of policy, right? So you can do things that, in the eyes of the organization that you are working for, is okay, but is very much not okay in reality, at least in a moral or an ethical sense, actually.
Okay, so it's allowed by policy, but it's immoral. Something's legal but immoral.
Correct.
Yeah, this is not a new thing under the sun.
Nope, not at all. But a lot of the times they're okay. Most people, the people that are perpetrators, right? The perpetrators of what we're talking about do so because there's no real repercussion outside of their own chain of command, right? So the people that are employing them to do this task, which by all means they probably don't care as long as they don't get caught. Because realistically, they care more about the optics of you getting caught doing the thing versus you actually doing the thing.
Yeah, there's a difference between feeling remorse for one's actions or feeling regret for being caught.
Yes.
Am I doing the right thing because this is the right thing, or am I doing the right thing because I don't want to get caught?
Hmm.
That's a
So,
moral question.
so now I'm saying, all right, well, if you removed the anonymity, right, and you put actual, I won't say tangible, but pretty close to tangible consequence in front of them. And
Hmm.
the way we spoke about it before this started up was if if you think no one knows where you live, they don't know your name, maybe they know your part of your badge number, not a big deal, right? But if I know where you live, if I know all of your kids' names, I know your wife, if I know all of them, I know where they go to school and everything, and I just place it at your doorstep and say like, maybe try not being a d bag, on some of these stops, or just whatever, right? In place some.
If you were to find if you were to be able to communicate that that person's actions are no longer going unnoticed.
Yes, and you're very visible now, right? It's
Yes.
almost similar to doxing, but not as messy as doxing.
Well,
Doxing,
we've talked about this in the past. We have not you and I particularly, but the subject is interesting because doxing is a difficult problem, and this is where we have an asymmetry. Is that functionally, when you buy a suppressor, your information is doxed to the government.
yes.
Okay, so is there any? But that's an asymmetrical relationship. So now, and there's an understanding for certain levels of secrecy and compartmentalization of information and confidentiality, and I understand all of this.
Yeah.
It's not completely like we just say abolish abolish information or whatever, because that doesn't mean anything. But what does mean something is that there's a gross asymmetry between the United States citizens and the government, or in government actors in this case.
Mhm.
And now, what are ways where we can turn that asymmetry back into a symmetrical organization? And some of them might have to come from the top down, and some of them can come from the bottom up.
From the bottom up, and I think they're not. No one's afraid of the bottom up, and that's the problem. That's
No, what do you mean? No one's afraid of the bottom up?
so anyone that has a modicum of power
Yeah.
are not afraid of the people.
Yes, they are. They're fucking
I
terrified.
don't think so.
Why would they be? Why? I know. I think they're absolutely terrified. I think they're terrified at the fact that why else would they be disarming populations?
Well, yes, because what we've seen this historically speaking, right? Because they know that they're removing the probability of a problem. That's essentially what that is. right? So they're like, all right, well, they're not worried about them of their own volition taking guns and rolling over and start steamrolling fucking municipalities and a judge's chamber. They're not worried about that. They
They're
want
not worried about it in they're not worried about it in immediacy. I think so they're worried about the potentiality of it. Okay, I can make that sense.
right. So they're worried about the probability of that happening maybe sometime in the future, and maybe they might do something that requires that kind of response. But for the most part, it's not something that they worry about being a right now problem because everyone's caught up in their regular everyday lives. No one's just like, you know what? I really hate the fucking government. Let's go kill everybody. Like that's never gonna be the thing, right? That's never happened. So
Yeah, no, that's not something that people think about. As
exactly.
in a rational not even a rational sense. It's not n- that is a caricature of a caricature of a caricature,
Yeah,
right? You
not
know, that's and you know why because it's a weird fever dream of people like Joe Biden, right?
yeah,
Oh, you're gonna fight the government. We have F-16s. It's like, okay, dude, like no one, you obviously are living in a fever dream,
yeah,
okay? Because the American population we're not talking about that activity. We're
right.
talking about asymmetrical situations. Like there's no redress of grievances. There's
Hmm.
no where there's no we're having a loss or a breakdown in the taxation without representation clause. We're having issues where it's like, it's not right that that a government organization can classify people as felons extra without legislature,
Yeah.
without writing in the law. It's not right for politicians to wield the Department of Justice so brazenly for certain activities. It's not right for people to gain billions of dollars or millions of dollars through foreign adversaries.
Yep.
These are concerns, but it's such a silly thing to think about.
Right. So that's more so what I'm thinking about. Like, yes, they can be afraid of the absolute extreme situation in which everyone's fed up at this, or just enough people are fed up at the exact same time, and they have an overwhelming amount of numbers coming at them, right? But that's just not. There's nothing at least historically speaking, to say that that would happen without some crazy freaking catalyst to happen. Um, so I don't think they're like worried in that sense. Um,
And even if they were, that wouldn't justify actions.
right. So that's
There's a consistency in certain lines of thinking that imposes the inevitability of a threat as justification for essentially a preemptive strike. And
yeah.
it does this by organizing the world through metaphysics into such a way that they're necessarily under the attack, and therefore they are infinitely justified at all times to lash out in what they're referring to as self-defense. And
Hmm.
this is visible in quite the most classic example, and I mean classic in the literature sense, is Marx. So it's you organize the world into well, it's not even Marx. It's sort of Leninistic Marx, but we're getting off the topic.
Yeah. So instead of that, right? Because we have Second Amendment. This that, like the biggest thing I've always put out is you have to know the enemy first, right? That's for anything. For any time you've ever done a mission in I don't know, you're Iraq and Afghanistan or
I
just
did. Yeah, I was in both.
both. Okay, I did Iraq twice. I didn't even get to go to Afghanistan. But
Mhm,
anytime you do that, you have an entire apparatus giving you and feeding you information at all points in time. To
mhm.
keep you on the mark, showing you the who, what, where, when, why. And like, if you don't have that here, and you're talking about like, we're gonna rise up, and I'm like, well, who are you fighting? You haven't even answered the one W that matters. Like who?
Okay, okay, yeah. I can see how this happens, right? So, like, when there was the Ohio Trail derailment situation,
Hmm.
you could see a lot of um, accusations being thrown at ambiguous organizations,
Yeah, but
but
no,
not at individuals.
exactly. So I'm like, if you can't even figure out that,
Yeah, I mean, this is what it means to review a bureaucracy, though. I think
yeah,
there's a solution to it. Is okay. Well, hey, I mean, and this is where you get into I'm jumping around way too much again. This is where you get in the review of a bureaucracy and why bureaucracies, especially government bureaucracies, need to have a level of transparency to them.
Hmm.
is so that people can say, "Oh, okay, well, this is how the mechanism is supposed to operate, and this is how it is operating. We need to make this adjustment here." And that means, your charity hire in the HR department doesn't have authority over the engineering department
Yeah,
because
but we're saying how it should work, or that like there is supposed to be a level of transparency. There is. That's the whole
we,
point.
we can acquire it though.
You
That's an achievable outcome.
100% through like FOIA, or you're supposed to be able to request those things. However, we're also acting as if these same exact organizations don't do deals in ways that are have zero transparency whatsoever.
Oh, we know that. Yeah, yeah, that happens for
Exactly.
sure.
So, but now we're going back to the recourse thing. There is no recourse because there's no accountability, and therefore, if there's no accountability, there can't be any what's the word I'm looking for? There can't be any consequence if there's no accountability. So where are you left with after that? And there's no accountability or there's no consequence because they don't fear anyone outside of their chain of command, right? There's no fear from the people that they're trying to keep it from. Then what's the point?
Yeah, because you're looking at somebody else's pond.
So it's like, yeah, no one cares. And then
No, it's not that no one cares, is that we care a lot about things that we have very little influence over.
I'll agree with that, but I don't know if so. When I think about just the average man,
Mhm.
most people, I won't say, there we go again with the most people. I would say the average person cares a lot about the controllables, which I don't necessarily blame them for. Control the controllables, right? They're worried about getting to work on time. They're worried about coming home, feeding the kids, fucking the wife, do whatever, right? But the things that they intimately have control over on the day to day, when they see something on the news, they're not like, you know what, I should get up and go do something. No one's thinking that for the most part, unless it's something like I've seen people like want to pay people to take care of any crazy bills that come out for like the Second Amendment or anything, but
Mhm.
that's about it. And even then, they're not really even getting involved. They're paying other people to get involved.
Mhm.
So life is fairly large. So I can understand like there's a lot of things to keep in contact with and kind of go through every day. It's hard keeping up with two businesses or a day job and a business.
Yeah,
So
I'm imagine you're working a lot.
yeah, but that's for anybody, right? I'm sure there are a lot of people out there working two and three jobs. Like that's kind of normal.
Mhm.
I'm saying I kind of understand as well for the average person that doesn't get involved in a lot of this stuff that they don't because there's a lot to deal with on a day to day basis. But the ability to remove yourself from that is becoming less and less plausible as time goes on. You really can't
I
afford.
I don't know if we're talking about removing ourselves. There is no frontier, no cabin in the woods to run off to. There's
Yeah,
no quiet life. There's
not
no disappearance. I would agree with that.
yeah, not in a physical sense. I think in a mental sense. I think a lot of people are just checked the fuck out.
Okay, I understand this. The problem with the being the check the being checked out on these subjects and sort of the challenge that I'm not I don't think I'm necessarily disagreeing with you in the sense it's that what for? Like what good does it do for a person who's struggling to pay the bills because of their work situation in Idaho? I'm using a giant example that doesn't exist.
Yeah, yeah.
A giant metaphorical. And what good does it do them to complain to be motivated by the newsman telling them that the corruption is happening over there? I'm not saying that there isn't an answer to the question. I am saying that maybe placing misplaced issue. We're putting more on the issue of the news and the circumstances of our day than we need to.
Mm,
I'm not talking about some form of stoicism. I'm not talking about some form of Greek metaphysics that claims that the physical world has no value or is evil or the demiurge or whatever we're going to go into. I'm making the claim of that might be your conscience telling you that you need to turn your attention towards what your values are and then how you live them out.
okay.
That might be your conscience warning you that, hey, you're focusing a lot on things that you don't have control over. And you can, but let's not start at that issue. Like the issue with the ATF is a really good example. ATF puts out this brace ruling. It's complete and total infringement, immoral all the way from the top down. Anyone who had their finger on the paperwork should probably be fired and barred from public office. My opinion. Anyone who had their involvement in that atrocious document should not be allowed to work for the federal government. And then later we can talk about things like um what's the word, returns to grace or whatever it is, a redemption story, fine. But the idea that you just arbitrarily attacked the population of the country on some decision because of something that you claim to know nothing about is probably not a good idea, and it will have consequences on the population.
Right.
All right. And so maybe I can't do anything on the federal level, but what I can do is pay attention to what's going on my local level.
Correct.
And so that is saying, and I know we talk about this very often, but it continues to go back towards the problem that we even started at the beginning was, why is our motivation always so damn apocalyptic? Why can't we look at what our values are and then build our churches and our castles on those, as opposed to perpetually justifying everything that we think to do to be right and true and good on the potential of some bad outcome? It's like,
Hmm.
like a cornered rabbit doesn't build a castle. That's not a really good saying, but like if you're always on the back foot, if you're never looking forward and saying, I think I'm going to go in that direction, I'm going to pursue that thing, and you will always be in second place. You will always be waiting for somebody to take your stuff. You'll always be waiting for something to happen.
Very true.
So
Hmm.
it's an attitude I find myself living in, and I find myself frustrated by. My motivations are different than my justifications. I think, am I doing what is right because it's right, or am I doing what it's right because it feels, but it's easy to justify when it's under threat.
Mm,
So,
yeah. Hey, dude,
well,
I have to bounce.
you have to bounce. I've held you for way too long. All
Yeah,
right, so where do people find you real quick, and then we'll call it a day?
for sure. And you guys can find me on Instagram on skypire_actual for my personal page. And then the business page is at Cloaked Entry Co. If you guys want to find classes or courses, go on to www.cloakedentryco.com and then go over to the courses tab.
All righty. So I know we are holding you right up to the moment of your next in speaking engagement, but Marcus, it's been great talking to you. I look forward to our next conversation. We'll talk to each other soon. And this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. If you want to support the show, head over to redactedculture.locals.com. We're going to open up another broader discussion there, and we'll talk to you later.